Hi everyone, my name's Scintilla Chingayipe and I am the host of this very exciting new series from the State Library Victoria called The Future of. And today is the very first episode and we'll be looking at citizenship. And before I get into that conversation and introduce our guest, I would like to acknowledge that this conversation is taking place on the land of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. I would like to respectfully pay my respects to their elders, past, present and emerging, and also acknowledge any other elders that might be listening into this conversation from other communities. And so, as I mentioned, this is the inaugural episode of this fortnightly series from the State Library Victoria called The Future of. We're discussing citizenship. I'm very excited about this one. And joining me today is Jess Scully. And Jess uses creativity to engage people in the future economy and with urban life in the 21st century, working towards a sustainable and inclusive world. In 2019, she was elected as Deputy Lord Mayor of the City of Sydney. Previously, she founded Vivid Ideas, Australia's largest creative industries event, supported emerging talent through projects such as Qantas Spirit of Youth Awards, sparked new thinking through TEDx Sydney, and transformed public space as a public art curator. She's also worked as a policy advisor, radio host, and magazine editor. And her first book, Glimpses of Utopia, was published by Pantera Press in August. Welcome, Jess, to the conversation. Lovely to
Thank,
have you.
thank you, Santilla. I'm so excited to be here. I'm so excited to be here for the first episode. And I also want to acknowledge that I'm coming to you from Gadigal land in the Eora Nation. Always was and always will be Aboriginal land.
Wonderful. And just for anyone that is tuning in, if you would like to join in the conversation, the hashtag for the conversation is SLV Future. That's SLV Future. So, Jess, we've got a lot to unpack, and I kind of want to go straight into it. And I want to know, is it enough as citizens living in a democracy to just show up on election day, cast our votes, and essentially have done our civic duty? Is that enough?
Look, Santilla, it's a really good start. And I'm hoping that if anyone is tuning in or from America or can vote in the American elections, that they will do that at the very least. And having your say in elections is really important. And who we elect to represent us makes a really big difference. But there's a whole lot of stuff that happens between elections, and there are lots of ways to get involved in the choices that are made on our behalf between elections. There are new pathways for more citizen participation and more active citizenship. And then there's also taking part in the pathways that already exist, the sort of systems of feedback and consultation that we have in our government processes currently. And I kind of think we need to do both.
So let's talk about that. Let's talk about the pathways that already exist. I mean, how else can people be involved in the structures that are currently in place?
So I'm a representative at a local government level, and then of course there's also the state government and federal government. But in most government processes, when there are policy changes, when there are changes to the way money is spent, or there might be planning changes, for example, that influence the kind of activity that can on in your local area, or the kinds of programs that are supported through grants and other programs, governments usually go out and ask for feedback. And they'll do that through a form of community consultation. They'll put a policy on exhibition, they'll let people know, and they'll ask for community input, they'll ask for submissions. And quite often, we don't hear from a hugely representative group of the community through those processes. It tends to be a narrower band of our community who understand that those processes are there or feel entitled or enabled to take part in those. In the conversations that I've had, so I've been an elected representative now for 4 years, and I've had conversations with lots of people who say to me, "Oh, I'm a tenant, so I don't get to vote in the local election. I don't get to have my say," and that's absolutely not true. We want to hear from tenants and people don't have to be landlords to have their say through those, or homeowners to have their say through those processes. But we generally tend to only hear from people who are kind of owner occupiers or live in their own home. People in our community are young and diverse. About 50% of Australians were either born overseas or have at least one parent who was born overseas. Yet the feedback we tend to get tends to come from a perhaps less culturally diverse group of people, and people who tend to be more comfortable in English. And they also tend to be older people, people who have perhaps the time and are familiar with the consultation processes and the feedback processes, know how things like development applications work more often than not, and they tend to be the people who give us feedback. So we're not really hearing from the broadest part of the community through the processes that we have today.
And why is that? Is it because, I mean, some of the conversations I've had with, peers have been centered around this idea of not feeling like they're represented. So why should I bother? Why should I engage with politics if I don't feel like my voice is being heard? Is that one of the factors that plays into that, or are there other issues at play?
There's so many factors. I think part of it is a lack of civics education in Australia. I mean, I don't think I ever learnt how the levels of government work at school. I don't think I was ever given that access into how to have my say. So I think we have a lack of civics education. I think the processes tend to be quite analog, or they tend to be, they're advertisements in the local paper, for example, which a lot of people might not read, or they might be processes where people have to seek out the information rather than having the information delivered to them. So you have to be aware and interested, know where to look. You have to have a level of participation already to be involved. Um, they tend to preference people who have a long term association with an area, rather than people who might be renting or might be living in a place for a shorter period of time. And a lot of the processes I've encountered also, um, they take place kind of like between 6 and 8 p.m. Consultation meeting, a time when people, like with young families, for example, are giving their kids dinner
Mhm.
and putting them to bed. So again, the processes tend to skew older for that reason. And you know what? It's also really boring. It's pretty boring. And you have to have a familiarity with the process to understand what a planning change that reads this way looks like in your lived experience. So there's an element of translation that's missing to explain why this stuff matters to all people.
Mm. But are you seeing a shift in that kind of civic engagement? I mean, I've sort of perhaps in the last 6 months noticed a shift, whether it's with the Black Lives Matter movement, for example, or even with climate change, where a lot of particularly young people have realized that some of the changes that they would like to see happening really do require shifts in policy. And so there's a lot of engagement, particularly in social media, around the things, practical things that people can do and call for, whether it's at a local government level or higher. And that's something that I haven't really, it's a very recent thing. And I'm wondering if you've also observed that shift.
I absolutely have. I think there is a tide that's turning in that regard. I think it's tricky though, because we haven't yet figured out how to turn that online activity and engagement, and even the public engagement, or even protest movements when we're able to have them, into the kind of messaging that government hears.
Mm.
And governments tend to receive information in really formalized processes. They're taking submissions on whether people like this thing or don't like this thing. They want the playground, they don't want the playground or the cycleway, whatever it is. And so the people who know how to have their voice heard assemble clearly on one side, and yet we might not have access to the Facebook posts or the petitions or whatever it is on the other side, that might demonstrate that there are other points of view. So activity and engagement is so important, but figuring out how to channel that stuff into processes that that hold accountable is the point of difference. And there are structures for this that I've encountered in other parts of the world, where you've actually where governments, usually encouraged by the community, have created ways for citizens to have their voices heard, in really more accessible but structured ways. So, for example, in Iceland, they have a kind of an online program where people go on and they're given access to kind of a virtual town budget, and then they apportion that to different needs, and then they also debate that with their neighbours who might have different ideas about where those budgets should go, because I think it's that idea of having your voice heard, but also having the information to support that. And so, I think it's that idea of having your voice heard, but also having the information to support that. And so I think it's that idea of having your voice heard, but also having the information to support that. And so I think it's that idea of having your voice heard, but also having the information to support that. And so I think it's that idea of having your voice heard, but also having the information to support that. And so I think it's that idea of having your voice heard, but also having the information to support that. And so I think it's that idea of having your voice heard, but also having the information to support that. And so I think it's that idea of having your voice heard, but also having the information to support that. And so I think it's that idea of having your voice heard, but also having the information to support that. And so I think it's that idea of having your voice heard, but also having the information to support that. And so I think it's that idea of having your voice heard, but also having the information to support that. And so I think it's that idea of having your voice heard, but also having the information to support that. And so I think it's that idea of having your voice heard, but also having but then also understanding the context and understanding the sometimes competing interests that governments have to manage,
Mm.
that helps lead to more informed participation in decision making and more informed citizens.
And so let's talk about representation at this level. Why is that important? I mean, why should the people that we elect or the people that represent us be representative of our communities?
Well, I think you just get better ideas. Um, you know, uh, the typical Australian is a 38-year-old woman. As I said, 50% of Australians were either born overseas or have at least one parent born overseas. So most of us, have access to other languages, other ways of thinking, other cultural traditions, other ways of solving problems, perhaps. And yet, the typical Australian politician is a 51-year-old man named Andrew, very specific, who has 2 degrees. One of them is a law degree. He owns 2 houses at least, and he comes from an Anglo-Saxon background. So the reality of Australia as a young, culturally diverse community isn't reflected in the people who make decisions on our behalf, which means they may not have had the life experiences that many Australians have. They may not have access to the broadest range of cultural traditions and histories and ideas to draw from, and they may have very different priorities and perspectives. So you're much more likely in Parliament to have been a lawyer or a management consultant than a designer or a nurse or a childcare worker, for example. So that also limits and distorts, I think, the kinds of choices that are made about what's important in the economy, and the kind of work that is useful and valued. So
Mm.
it's about having different perspectives and priorities and different problem solving tools at the table.
Mm. And you talk about this concept of having NIMBYs and YIMBYs. First of all, can you define for those listening what you mean when you classify people as NIMBYs and YIMBYs?
Yeah, look, and this is absolutely, and it's a sort of playful term, but I think it denotes something that is important. So the idea of a NIMBY is a person who says, "Not in my backyard." They say, "You know what? I love affordable housing, but just not in this neighborhood. I know I love the idea of a cycleway, but not on my street. It's not the right place for it." So they're basically people who um, aren't willing to often make concessions or sacrifices on behalf of in service of a greater good in many instances, or they're people who tend to preference the status quo in a really significant way. A YIMBY is a person who says yes in my backyard. And there is actually a bit of a global movement of YIMBYs, particularly in cities like San Francisco, where there's a huge housing affordability problem. And so, what they're trying to do is encourage people in their community, in the San Francisco context, to say, do you know what? Let's have more density in this area so we can have more affordable housing. Let's put these conditions on land use so that we can achieve a social outcome. And the challenge that we have is that many of the people who understand how the processes work and who are very good at having their voices heard tend to fall more in the status quo camp. They tend to want things to stay the way that they are for many reasons. And we hear less from people who are in support of positive change and who are willing to make sacrifices or willing to advocate for things to open up or change in some way. So we got to get more YIMBY voices heard to balance that out.
Mhm. And so, how do we increase civic engagement? I mean, as you talked about, there are barriers, whether it's education, class, etc. I mean, how do we encourage more civic engagement?
I think we actually need formalized ways of doing this. We do need civic leaders who are going to try and make the process more transparent and try and communicate that to more people. We absolutely need more representative people representing us. And so we need to see what the barriers are to people standing for office. For example, in New South Wales, where I'm from, only 31% of local government councillors are women. And that in part is because of the very real disincentives there are in the way that the roles are funded or supported, so that people who take on these roles, it often find it quite difficult to balance the demands of this role in the way it's compensated with family life, for example, or the idea of having a career. So there's the structural disincentives to who represents us, but then which we need to address. But then in terms of creating more pathways for people to be civically engaged, there are probably some programs that could be tried, like the one from Iceland that I mentioned, Better Neighbourhoods. There are processes which places like Taiwan have become really good at doing. They're processes of social decision making and sort of testing out the problem set, bringing in stakeholders to um, actually break that problem apart and redefine the issue that needs to be determined. And they're using a lot of the tools of the tech startup in terms of problem solving there. And then there are other pathways like citizens' juries and citizens' assemblies that are more one off methods of actually working out the public appetite for change and what people are willing to do to make positive social change. And it's interesting because a citizens' assembly is something that's kind of cutting across the political divides at the moment. It's both a demand of the quite radical Extinction Rebellion movement, and it's also something that Boris Johnson and Emmanuel Macron in France have recently tried as well. So we're seeing the UK and France, who are conservative and centrist, undertaking citizens' jury and citizens' assembly processes on climate action at the same time as you have someone like XR calling for it as well. So it's there's a range of processes, and a lot of them are really about engaging a demographically representative group of people, empowering them with all the knowledge and access to experts, and then also giving them the imprimatur to have a decision making role. And they're just, and some of those processes go a step further as well, and they pay people who give their time to this piece of what is public service,
Mm.
so that income isn't a barrier to people participating, so that we get more socioeconomic diversity in our decision makers as well.
Mm. That just got me thinking because, obviously investing in these sorts of pathways requires resources. And that is not necessarily something, I mean, call me a cynic, that political leaders would essentially be inclined to invest in, particularly if you're trying to uphold a, status quo. If you're trying to hold on to power, are you more likely to open it up so other people can come in and disrupt your own position? So in the absence of that willingness, from, higher levels of government to invest in those pathways, what other options are there, for citizens? Because I'm sort of thinking about, I look at places like the United States, for example, where you look at the rise of someone like Alexandra Ocasio Cortez, grassroots, independently funded, really lobbying for change and obviously getting this community support. I mean, are these the sorts of models that perhaps we could start seeing in Australia, where if people do feel like they're not, one, being represented or supported by the larger political parties, that whether it's at a local government level, that could be a place to kind of trial some of these ideas and pathways. Is that the way forward in some of these things?
I am very biased and absolutely think so. I mean, I think local government has enormous potential to be the place where you begin um, showing what this looks like. And that's
Mm,
why I'm involved in local government. And one of the key reasons is I think, you're at a level of government that is closer to individual communities. You can see the impact on the ground. And I think globally as well, there's been a big movement. It's called radical municipalism, and it's where people are taking town halls and using local government as an opportunity and a tool for showing what social change looks like. And so there have been some really remarkable successes in that regard, particularly in places like Spain, but also in the UK. There are some great examples. There's a couple of towns, a town called Preston, for example, where by having a local government in there that is determined to focus on economic and social justice, and by turning all of their spending power and their policy focus on immediately improving the conditions of people's lives in that area in a very direct and activist sense, they've been able to draw out more engagement, because the reality is people are disillusioned with politics because
Mm,
politics has let them down.
mm,
They're completely justified in their cynicism about politics. It has become divisive, and it has become beholden to party interest and donor interests, and it has become removed from, um, I think, a lot of the key values and demands of people. And you see it in things like the marriage equality campaign, for example, where clearly, a huge percentage of Australians wanted a change in that department, but parties didn't have the courage to proceed with that without the postal vote. And similarly with climate action at the moment, we're seeing 85% of Australians, I think, in a poll by the ABC this year, want action on climate change immediately, and yet we have seen action stall. So I think starting at a local government level, where it is also easier to overcome the influence and the dominance of the major parties and getting new voices elected, is a really important way to start. But I think it's also really important to keep in mind that just because it's local, it doesn't mean that you can't have global focus and global solidarity and intend to tackle the global issues locally.
mm,
So I think quite often people in local government are told to stick to their knitting and focus on roads, rates, and rubbish. And I think that's rubbish. I think really it's about having immediate and tangible impact on climate action and social justice at every level of government. And you're more likely to have an opportunity to get in at a local level.
mm. And I'd imagine that it kind of gets. I mean, I don't know if contagious is the correct word, but I'll just use it in this context. But I'd imagine that if you have a leader that's coming through the system in your own local government area where you feel like you're being represented, is it a situation where next door you might kind of go, hang on a second, if they've got a leader that is truly representative of the people, I might want that, and so you end up demanding for that. Is that kind of like the knock-on effect that does sometimes perhaps manifest from this sort of level of organizing at a local government level?
I think so. I really do. I think we do have to get out and support those people who are trying to stick their heads above the parapet, because it
Mm,
is a pretty crummy gig. Like
mm,
I've been talking to a couple of people over the past few years who've run in Victorian elections as well and at local government elections, and it's brutal, and like this is the toughest part-time job I've ever had, and I can understand why a lot of people wouldn't want to do it. So I think the role that everyone can play who doesn't want to directly get involved is to lend your voice in support and your vote in support of those people, but also to be a YIMBY. And that's, I think, what being a YIMBY is about, right? It's about saying, okay, you tell me when there is a consultation period for the new children's playground or the car park or the solar panel policy change or whatever it is, and I'll be there to add my voice to the chorus in support of positive change. So not everyone has to run, thankfully. There's only a few people silly enough to undertake that at the moment, but if you want to see positive change, figure out where your voice is useful. And sometimes petitions and online engagement isn't as useful as figuring out or talking to people about how to have your voice heard in those ways that government hears.
mm. So why did you choose to, you know, enter politics? Like what was it that propelled you to sort of go, you know what, I feel like I can contribute in this way?
Um, well, for me, it was actually, following in the footsteps of someone who I admire. So Clover Moore's the Lord Mayor of Sydney, and I've been living in Sydney for about 20 years, and I could see what a tangible impact having someone who was focused on climate justice and the arts and culture and social justice. I could see it, what it looked like. And I also, through the work that I'd done in the creative sector, I realized that you could have the best, creative pool in the world. You could have really talented people and great products and productions. But if you didn't have stages to put them on, if you didn't have venues for people to rehearse in, if you didn't have public transport for people to get in and out of those places, then you wouldn't be able to access audiences. And I realized that city making is an enabling or disabling factor in the growth of the creative economy. And my motivation is to try and move Australia from the extraction to the knowledge and resource, the knowledge and creative economy and the caring economy. And I thought that I could have the best impact doing that at a local level. And I also just think, you know, cities like Sydney and Melbourne are the luckiest places in the world. We have this extraordinary privilege in these places. And because of that, we also have, I think, an obligation to be exemplars of what inclusive and sustainable city making looks like.
Mm.
And yet we have every possible advantage to try and make it work, and prove that you can make cities a positive contributor to the 21st century.
Mm. And so how do you stay optimistic, given that obviously in politics things move very slow and sometimes change does take a very, very long time, and you've got obstacles and all of these challenges in the way of you trying to, bring about some of the changes that you'd like to see in your lifetime. How do you stay optimistic in the face of all of that adversity?
Um, I think I stay optimistic because I do see positive change happening. And this crisis that we've just been through and the lockdown that Melbourne's been through more than any other place, really. To me, it was the first time in my lifetime that I saw uh, government and society put people ahead of the economy, and I found that what I observed was this extraordinary global act of care in protecting the most vulnerable people in society, by saying no, we will stop everything to protect people from this risk. And that to me was an incredibly encouraging sign that maybe we are willing and open to have a conversation about what else we might do as a society, to enable people's quality of life and to enable a more sustainable planet. So I think that was, to me, of course, it was a huge shock, but it was also, in a way, heartening and reassuring. The other thing that gives me hope is that I do see examples all over the world. And I think one of the challenges we have in this kind of goldfish media environment that we live in, where we just sort of like the news hits us and changes every day like a wave, is that we forget that this is not the only way things can be. Actually, there's a world of other pathways and alternative ways of doing things and relating to each other and making decisions, prioritizing money spend, that we could learn from if we would look beyond the four walls of our immediate experience, and also that the span of history is much longer than we see in that very short term news cycle. So what I think we need to do is learn from the world. We need to look beyond the Anglosphere, and we need to see where there are alternative ways of being and organizing, and see what we can borrow and bring back to use here.
I think that's a great note to end the conversation on. I think you've really given me certainly a lot to think about in terms of what I can do in terms of my own engagement, because I won't lie, I have been feeling a bit disillusioned. And it's obviously there's obviously other things that I can do that ensure that my contribution counts. And so thank you so much for joining us on this very first conversation for the Future of series. It's been such a pleasure having you. And thank you to everyone that's tuned in to listen to this live conversation. We'll be back in a fortnight discussing the future of Indigenous design, which I'm very, very excited about. But yeah, thank you to the State Library of Victoria and to you, Jess Scully. It's been such a pleasure.
Thanks, Angela. This has been really a big pleasure.